Have you ever been targeted by law enforcement for no reason at all? What if they tried to intimidate you into showing ID, despite knowing you're not required to? In today's story, we watch a group of officers who, despite their authority, completely misread the situation and end up making a fool of themselves. When they approach an innocent individual, the officers quickly assume they have a reason to demand identification, only to be faced with a surprising twist. As the tension rises, we see the officers struggle to uphold their authority, unaware that they've picked the wrong person to mess with. This isn't just about the officers getting it wrong, though it's about standing up for your rights and knowing when to push back. What happens when someone refuses to hand over their ID? Watch as the situation goes from bad to worse for the officers, leaving them scrambling to save face. But here's the thing, it's not over yet. These cops have no idea what's coming next, and they're about to get a lesson they won't forget. Stick around to see how this situation escalates, and how it all comes crashing down for the officers. You won't want to miss the outcome. It all started on a quiet afternoon, when the man was simply walking down the street, minding his own business. Little did he know, he was about to be stopped by law enforcement for no reason at all. As he casually strolled, a squad car pulled up beside him. Two officers jumped out and immediately began questioning him, asking for identification. The man, already aware of his rights, calmly refused. He knew that, under the law, he wasn't required to provide ID unless he was being detained or suspected of a crime. But the officers didn't seem to care about that. They insisted, trying to intimidate him with threats of arrest, but the man remained firm. The more they pressed, the more obvious it became that they didn't know what they were doing. It was clear they didn't fully understand the legal boundaries they were crossing, and their frustration was starting to show. Every time they tried to escalate the situation, the man stayed calm, refusing to back down. As the minutes ticked by, the officers grew more desperate. They were used to getting compliance, but this time, something wasn't going according to plan. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a bigger confrontation that would expose their lack of knowledge and throw their authority into question. As the standoff continued, the tension in the air became palpable. The officers, clearly frustrated, started circling around him like sharks, trying to figure out how to regain control. One officer, growing visibly agitated, attempted to use his authority to intimidate the man. He demanded that the man step aside, threatening that failure to comply could lead to arrest. But the man was unwavering, his calm demeanor almost infuriating the officers more. It was like a game of cat and mouse, but this time, the man wasn't backing down. Nearby, a small crowd had begun to gather, curious about the scene unfolding. Some watched silently, while others murmured, exchanging whispers about the rights of citizens and the power of law enforcement. A few even pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. The man remained composed, occasionally glancing at the crowd, sensing this shift in the atmosphere. He was no longer just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been wrongly targeted by the system. The officers, realizing they weren't getting anywhere, tried a different tactic. One of them made an attempt to gather additional information, questioning the man's motives and even his intentions for being in the area. It was becoming clear they were grasping at straws, searching for any excuse to escalate the situation further. But the man kept answering their questions with simple, direct responses, remaining focused on his rights, not their threats. In the background, one of the officers was getting more aggressive, edging closer to the man. You could feel the heat rising as their personal egos seemed to take over, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't just about the law anymore. The power struggle was at the heart of it, and neither side was willing to let go. But with each passing second, The officers were sinking deeper into their own trap, and the man was inching closer to winning this battle of wits. The situation was rapidly escalating. The officers were losing control, and the crowd around them was starting to grow, more people pulling out their phones to document the exchange. The man's resolve never wavered as the officers tried everything to get him to submit, first with threats, then with demands for answers that had no legal backing. One of the officers, clearly the more impatient of the two, stepped forward and raised his voice. "You think you know the law? We'll see about that," he snapped, reaching for his radio. The air grew tense, and the crowd fell silent, knowing something was about to break. The officer muttered into the radio, likely requesting backup or assistance in handling the situation. The man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, facing the officer directly, unwavering. With the radio call in place, the officer began circling again, trying to get the man to move. Every second felt like an eternity. The tension was almost unbearable, and the audience could feel the shift. The man had somehow turned the tables, leaving the officer scrambling. What were they going to do next? Would they back down? Would they escalate? In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard, but it wasn't clear if they were part of the officer's backup or just another random car in the area. The man's calmness had made the officers second-guess their next steps. Should they force the issue? Or was this a battle they were about to lose? The crowd murmured, sensing that whatever happened next would be a defining moment. Just as the sirens grew louder, the unexpected happened. From behind the crowd, another squad car pulled up, but this one was different. It wasn't part of the backup the officers had called for. The new officers didn't seem to be on the same page. As they got out of the car, one of them immediately noticed the tension, sensing that something wasn't right. They started to scan the situation, their eyes flicking between the first officers and the man at the center of it all. The moment of confusion was palpable. The newly arrived officers took a few steps toward the crowd and began talking to bystanders, while the two officers still confronting the man were clearly growing more uncomfortable. Their initial confidence had already been shattered, and now they found themselves caught in an unexpected web of their own making. It was clear they were out of their depth. One of the new officers, after observing the scene for a few moments, began walking toward the original officers. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone neutral, but there was an edge of suspicion in his voice. The tension between the two groups of officers was immediate, and the man, still calm, couldn't help but notice the shift in dynamics. Suddenly, the officer who had been leading the confrontation, realizing he might be in trouble, made a snap decision. He turned to the man and demanded, "You need to move now, or we'll have to escalate this." But it wasn't just the words. There was a flash of panic in his eyes, something that made everyone uneasy. Was he about to make a dangerous mistake? Or had the tide finally turned? The crowd's whispers grew louder, and the man glanced at the new officers, sensing their growing unease. The situation had reached a tipping point, and it was clear. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. The officers were not only losing control of the situation, but they were now on the brink of making a fatal misstep. The standoff reached its peak when the first officer, growing increasingly desperate, made a sudden move. Without warning, he stepped forward, reaching out to grab the man's arm. The crowd gasped in unison, some instinctively stepping back, others instinctively moving closer. It was a moment of pure tension, an officer making the decision to escalate. But as soon as the officer's hand touched the man, something unexpected happened. The new officer, who had been silently observing the situation, stepped in quickly. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm, but not harsh. His words were a command, but it was clear there was no room for debate. The crowd held their breath, watching as the two original officers looked at each other, stunned and unsure of how to respond. The new officer's presence alone shifted the balance. He stood between the man and the original officers, calmly but decisively telling them to step back. "This is over," he said. The tension was thick, but it was clear that the situation had changed. The officers, realizing they were in the wrong, began to slowly retreat. Their faces were a mix of frustration and disbelief. They had lost. But just when it seemed like the man had won, another twist came. As the crowd started to disperse, a third officer, previously unnoticed in the back, approached the man with a smirk. "You got lucky today," he muttered under his breath, his voice low but full of warning. The man, still calm, locked eyes with him, refusing to show any fear. The officer's words hung in the air like a threat, but it was clear the power had shifted. The man had stood his ground, exposed the officer's ignorance, and walked away unscathed. But the tension in the air lingered, a reminder that not all battles are fought in the moment, and sometimes the real fight is just getting started. The crowd had witnessed something powerful, something they wouldn't forget anytime soon. The man had proven that knowledge of your rights was more than just important. It was the key to holding those in power accountable. And as the sirens faded into the distance, the man walked away, knowing he had made a statement. What would happen next? Only time would tell. As the crowd began to thin out, the man walked away, his steps steady and purposeful. The officers, left to process what had just happened, exchanged a few words among themselves, clearly defeated. The unexpected intervention from the new officer had turned the tide in a way they didn't see coming. But there was something else, a sense of accountability in the air. The crowd had witnessed an important moment, where a citizen had stood up for their rights and walked away without being intimidated. The man, though victorious, didn't celebrate. He knew this encounter was just one of many, a reminder that standing up for your rights wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. He glanced around, noticing the bystanders who were still recording, some of them smiling, others deep in thought. It was clear that this interaction had made an impact. For many, it was a reminder of the importance of knowing your rights in the face of authority, and how sometimes the fight for respect was won in the quiet moments of defiance. As he disappeared into the distance, the echoes of the encounter lingered, leaving everyone to reflect on the powerful lesson they had just witnessed. That the truth, when spoken firmly and calmly, was something that couldn't be easily ignored. And with that, the story came to an end, not with anger or violence, but with a quiet victory. A victory that would resonate long after the scene had passed.